ओम नमः श्री यतिराजाय विवेकानंद सूरये सच्चित सुख स्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे. In all the previous classes, we saw how the interaction of the three gunas, a combination of the three gunas, provides the motive power for Prakriti, also known as Shakti in the Tantras, for the creative process. Parama Prakriti, when it is one with Brahman or one with Purusha, it does not create. And the question of freedom does not arise. Everybody is free. But slowly, the creative process begins and Prakriti starts manifesting itself with the help of three gunas. We discussed that in great detail. So the three gunas combine with each other and create different types of beings. They can be inanimate beings, they can be animate beings, living beings like human beings, like plants. So, depending on the preponderance of sattva, we say that a person or a created being is highly evolved. The more sattva there is in any person, he is highly evolved. And the more tamas there is in proportion to the other two gunas, that created being, living or non-living, is said to be very low in the evolution. So we start with the inanimate world. When we come to the animate beings, we start with the primitive viruses, the bacteria, then we go on evolving into bigger and bigger uh, beings, bigger in the sense more complex beings. Like we come to the plants, then we come to the animals, and then we come to the animals who are very near to the human beings, who can understand, who can think, who has got a higher level of manas. So when the subtle, the physical or the gross body, the subtle body which comprises of the subtle indriyas and the mind which we cannot see, and also the karana sharira, the samskaras, these have more element of sattva. Then we say that created being is highly evolved. And the goal of all spirituality, any sadhana, whether it is bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, raj yoga, or any other yoga, or even karma yoga, is how to evolve. And this evolution of an individual to higher and higher levels in this creative process with the help of Prakriti, of course. Either you say Prakriti or you say Shakti. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, without the help of Shakti or Prakriti, one cannot be liberated, because just as she has created and created more and more bondage for everyone, the same process has to be reversed. And when it is reversed through sadhana, through yoga, and we go back by the same process, we got involved. Involution presupposes evolution. What do you mean by involution? Involution means we go from the subtlest to more and more gross till we become like stones, till we become inanimate. But following the reverse process, you will find that we become more and more subtle. We meditate or use our manas to not just to react to outer circumstances and become free. When it becomes buddhi, when it becomes more and more of the buddhi in the whole mind, in our whole subtle body, the buddhi, when it becomes predominant, then you say the mind is fully sattvic. Naturally, it presupposes that the body is also sattvic. So with all the sattva, we gain clearer and clearer understanding, and we reverse, more importantly, we reverse the creative process, and then we go to the source of creation, which is Purusha, and that is when we become mukta, we become free. And the nearer you are to the Purusha or Brahman, of course with the help of Shakti, that is that is manifesting of more spirituality in your life. That is what spirituality is all about. Any religion which you follow or any religious sect in the world, it teaches us how to go back to our source, which is God, or known as Brahman or Purusha. What is the God of the Christians, the Father in heaven of Christians? What is the Brahman of Vedanta, the Purusha of Sankhyas, the the state of Buddha in Buddhism, that is Nirvana, one who reaches Nirvana, who entangles from the shackles of Prakriti, from these gunas, and unites with the pure consciousness which is known as Bodhi. He becomes a Buddha. So that is the idea. Now in the Hindu system, we will find the first creation, the evolution from undifferentiated Prakriti is called Mahat, that is the universal mind, the great cause. There is where all the Karana Shariras of all human beings, for everybody, it is the great cause. So human beings do not, all the beings do not evolve all of a sudden. According to Sankhya, Hindu system, Sankhya explains, forms the bedrock for the process of creation, even in Vedanta. So Sankhya, Vedanta are very similar in philosophy. So first, in the Hindu system, the first stage of evolution is the undifferentiated Prakriti, which is Mahat. Now you have to understand this. This undifferentiated Prakriti is called Mahat, the great cause. So the great cause in Vedanta also, it is known as Ishvara. When you say we worship Ishvara, what do? We pray to the great cause and tell him, you have caused, from you has come this whole creation. As the Christians believe in the Father in heaven, and he created this whole universe. So also Hindus believe that Ishvara or Mahat is the first manifestation of Prakriti in the creation, and it is undifferentiated. It is not differentiated, but slowly it gets, that's why it is known as the great cause. And our Karana Shariras, the smaller ones, they are form part of this undifferentiated Prakriti or Ishvara. Mahat is the cosmic ego sense, the first drawing of differentiated consciousness. Then a comparison can be made to the spirit moving on the face of waters, which is mentioned in the book of Genesis. If you read the Bible, or if you read the New and Old Testament, they say there is a spirit which moves on the face of waters. What do you mean? Waters is the gross universe which has come out, but the spirit animates it. And that spirit, through, when it comes through the cosmic ego sense or Mahat, the Ishvara, it is the first drawing of, the first manifestation of the differentiated consciousness. Then the gunas come, all the different gunas. From Mahat, we will see it is evolved the Buddhi, the discriminative faculty in each human being, which is the highest manifestation, a sattvic manifestation, which has already been described. We discussed what Buddhi is as compared to the Manas or the reactive mind. From Buddhi is evolved Ahankara, the individual ego. So that is why when we come down, when we involve, it's not evolution, it is involution. How we become differentiated into human beings, this has to be understood. The first, from Buddhi is involved the Ahankara, the individual ego sense, that I am so and so, I have such and such a body. If that ego goes, then we become one with the buddhi, which helps us to unite ourselves with the pure Brahman. That is known as mukti, pure Brahman or pure Purusha. But the individual ego sense right now is making us feel that we are separate, we are limited beings. We know there is there is an unlimitable universe or a cosmic mind or Ishvara or God or Purusha or Brahman. There is this existence, but somehow in the process of involution, not evolution, we reverse the process and then we say it is evolution. We evolve to higher and higher beings. We manifest more of the spirit. But right now, the spirit is involving as matter. It is going down. The ego sense comes. And the lines of evolution from Ahankara, now they branch off in three directions, as I said. What are the three branches of this Ahankara? First comes Ahankara, and it branches off in three different directions. One direction is the Manas, the reactive mind. The second is the Indriyas of perception, the sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. Manas is the recording facility. You have to remember that. What do we mean by Manas? Is the reactive portion which, in collaboration with the second class of Indriyas, which are known as powers of perception, the sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. Every human being, every animal uses these five senses. Even in plants, you can find these things. They smell in a different way. They hear in certain, they hear the vibrations. They perceive the vibrations. Perceiving is a better word. We say it is hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, and seeing for human beings. But what do you mean by sight for a plant? How does a plant see? How does a plant smell? How does a plant hear? How does a plant taste? And how does a plant touch? We know that most of these plants have these sense organs, but it works in a different way, which is not perceptible to us. We do not know how a dog smells. His sense of smell is much better than us. It can smell things which are far off. It has a very keen sense of smell. So the Indriya, power of perception of smell, is stronger in a dog than even a human being. There are some animals, the kites, which have a very strong sense of sight. It can see even a small animal below when it is miles away. It can just swoop down and see very, very small objects. So their power of sight or visualizing things is much more than human beings. Human beings also have this, but they have created technology to enhance their sense of perception. They are just helping us. We are using the powers of Prakriti to enable us to sight better, microscope, electron microscope or telescopes to see big distant objects, to see minute objects we have microscopes. So our power of sight we have increased using artificial means, using our buddhi, using our intellect. So also our smelling capacity, our hearing capacity, we can have hearing aids, we can hear using that, then taste and then touch and all those things. So we can have very sensitive equipment to monitor all these things. But what is the other branch? One is the Manas, recording facility of the mind. Another is the perceiving or the experiencing powers of perception, five powers of perception, and then there are corresponding five organs of action. The organs of action are tongue, taste for taste, feet, hands, the organs of evacuation and procreation. So these are the five organs of action through which a animal or a human being communicates with the external world. So this is involution actually. From Mahat we have come to Buddhi, the discriminative faculty. Then the ego sense comes when we go down the hierarchy. Then comes Ahankara, ego, that is ego sense. And when we go still below, we produce these five organs of perception and five organs of actions. And then what happens is the five tanmatras. Tanmatras means they are the subtle elements, which are the inner essences of the five: sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. We have Indriyas. Now, there should be corresponding objects. What are those corresponding objects? There are objects also can be divided into two categories. One is subtle and the gross. We see only the gross, but where are the subtle tanmatras? They are known as the five tanmatras, which are the subtler essences of sound, feelings, aspect, flavor, and odor, the smell. These subtle tanmatras, when they combine with each other, they produce the five gross elements. They are in different combinations. There is a little element of sound in fire also. Fire means it is something like a plasma state. We'll come to that. Earth, water, fire, and ether, of which the external universe is composed. According to Vedanta, the grossest manifestation is earth, that is solids, water, that is all liquids. So the water is not purely, some liquids are semi-solids. So a little combination of earth and water will get you a semi-solid or a semi-liquid, or there will be just liquid. Fire is something like ether. When there are this gaseous, its gaseous form is air. The ether, air, and fire, air, and ether, of which ether is space, the empty akasha from which everything has come, of which the external universe is composed. So for perception, for involution, from the pure Brahman, when we come down, you have to remember this order, because we have to go back. This is like coming down the steps of the terrace. We come down one step, one step, one step, one step, and then we come to the bottom. And then we want to evolve. We go from the external universe, the five gross combination of five gross elements, which we see: earth, water, fire, ether, and all those things. Then we go to the sound, feelings, aspect, flavor, and all those things, odor, which are the subtle tanmatras associated with these material objects. Then we go to the five organs of action, which we can see: tongue, feet, hands, and other things. And then we go to the powers of perception, the sight, smell. Then all these things combined reacts on the reactive mind, or manas, which is the recording facility. So these different elements, the external elements, the internal organs, the gross and subtle, both, they interact on the subtle mind. And the mind is the recording facility, or it records everything and passes it on to the buddhi to decide what to do with this. It says, I have shown you, I have shown you what is there in front of you. I have shown you a sweet. Now the tongue has shown, the tongue actually gets perceives when it eats a sweet, and then the samskara is given to the reactive mind, and the reactive mind decides that I should eat more. But the buddhi says, don't eat more. So a higher evolution of the mind prevents us from just succumbing to the pressures of the gross. The gross always has a tendency, the gross objects, whether it is earth, water, fire, or ether, and the subtle tanmatras, and the subtle senses, and the organs of action, all these 20 elements of Prakriti, which is a combination of gross and subtle, make us go towards the gross. The natural tendency of a human being is to gravitate towards the gross. So to become a worldly person, it doesn't require any effort. Very naturally, Prakriti has created us in such a way that it sees objects outside. It does not try to see inside. There is a beautiful verse in the Kathopanishad. I am not tired of repeating that. Paranchi khani vyatrunat swayambhu tasmat param pashyati na antaratman. Paranchi khani means unfortunately, the sense organs, the sense of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch, God has created them. It is like a valve. You know, there are certain walls in the arteries which prevent the blood, the pure blood, it allows the blood to flow, but it prevents the impure blood from going back. So it has to flow in one direction. So also the in the veins, I mean, in the veins. So the impure blood, otherwise there is a chance that it will mix. But the unidirectional approach of the senses are unidirectional in the sense, unless you struggle to go against it, it is like the current. That is a better example than these walls, because in the walls they don't allow you to go back in. But you take the example of a flowing stream, it is flowing downstream. So our organs very naturally take us down, it takes us downstream. So spirituality is like flowing against the current. So you have to flow. The indriyas always tend to take you towards grosser and grosser objects. So you can't blame a human being if he's tempted by the worldly things. We say that it is not good. What we mean by worldly things, there's nothing wrong in worldly things. That is also a creation of Prakriti. But the problem is it makes us gross. To live with the gross things is not bad, but to be attracted towards them, that is, we are going against the process. I mean, the creation is taking away us. Further we go from the Purusha, from Brahman, from God, the more we get entangled in these subtle tanmatras and the gross elements. So sadhana, to sum all this up briefly, creation here is described as an evolution outward from the undifferentiated Brahman to the differentiated Prakriti. So the more the differentiation is there, uh, the undifferentiated consciousness, first it comes from mind. The undifferentiated consciousness first becomes differentiated because of ego, ahankara. Then it becomes further differentiated into the different organs, and becomes from subtle mind, it becomes matter. When a human being takes birth, he is living in the subtle body. So from the subtle body, it is actually an evolution outward, not an evolution inward. He evolves outward, he takes up a new body, and gradually he is covered this pure consciousness, which before his birth, that is why Shukadeva, in a beautiful explanation given in the Bhagavata, they say Shukadeva did not want to be born. He did not want to come out of the mother's womb, knowing that once he comes out, he will be gradually covered by layers and layers of ignorance, and then he has to struggle to go back. So he said, I was happy. I was happy in the undifferentiated consciousness of Brahman. Why the Prakriti is forcing me to be born? So they say, according to the story, it's a mythological story, but you remember, behind this mythology is the wonderful idea that the pure consciousness does not want to be differentiated, but it is by gravity, it is forced. It is forced by the sheer force of gravity, the outward evolutionary force of Prakriti. So Prakriti forces you to become gross and from mind to become matter. So the subtle body, so he did not want to be born. But anyway, Shukadeva was born after a long period. They say for 15 years he refused to be born. But then because of the prayers of Vyasa, he said, if you are not born, then who will show us the way back? You know the way back, you know how to explain spiritual evolution. And that is how he gave the wonderful message of the Bhagavatam. That is how the story goes. The Bhagavatam is the story of evolution. How everybody knows we evolve outward and become gross human beings, even become animals, become plants. But the reverse process, if one is lucky at the human being level, when he comes to the level of human, he evolves further up. And that evolution is what is taught in the Bhagavatam or all the scriptures, the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Bible. Everybody seems to tell us what is spiritual evolution. So pure consciousness, which gradually was covered by successive layers of ignorance, which Shukadeva did not want. He said, once I am born, then all the temptations of the world, I have to struggle to overcome it. So why should I be born in the first place? That is why people don't want to be born. When you say that we want mukti, we don't want bondage, some people have a tendency towards freedom. But behind that idea of freedom It begins with physical freedom. First, we want to be physically free. We want to be free from any pressure from the external gross world. Once we are free, we want to be mentally free. See how the idea of freedom evolves in a human beings. When we go back, what is the sign of spirituality? The more spiritual a person is, the more freedom he wants. The first freedom everybody wants, every normal human being wants to be free in the gross world. He wants to eat what he likes and he thinks that is freedom. He wants to behave as he likes, he wants to do what he likes. Any kind of pressure on a child when it grows, it feels that it is suffocated. Its freedom is successive. Somebody is trying to force him to do certain things. But once he gets that gross freedom, he evolves into a higher idea of freedom. He wants to be mentally free. It's not enough if you give him freedom to do what he likes. That is a lower freedom, and very often it leads to problems. But if you evolve into a higher idea of freedom, where your mind wants to be free, where the spirit wants to be free, you want to be free mentally, and at the most you want somebody to guide you to make you free. You may not be able to free, just as you want somebody to help you to be free from all worries. That is why we earn money. What is the reason why we earn and uh, collect money? Why do we save money? We save because we want freedom from material poverty. We know that we will be material if we are deprived of certain things when we want it. So to remove material poverty, we try for material freedom and earn money and save it. We don't waste it. But somehow, successively, he gets higher and higher ideas of freedom. He, after satisfying his material freedom, he says, now I'm practically free. I don't want to be more free than this. But I want mental freedom. I don't want people to pressurize me to do things which I don't want. But knowing fully well that our minds are interconnected and freedom is not possible in the mind, he goes a little higher. He tries to leave the level of the reactive mind and goes to the buddhi. When he goes to the level of buddhi, he may be bound physically, he may be bound mentally. It may appear that Shukadeva was in this world. He had also hunger like us, he had thirst like us, he had all the indriyas like us, and he could see the world interact, but he was not bound by them. That is the difference, because he had known the technique, he knew the technique how to stay at the level of buddhi, where the layers, successive layers of cover ignorance, the gross materials were not able to suffocate his mind, the higher mind, I mean the buddhi. And each layer which is grosser and thicker the one below it, unless the process ends and the outer physical surface of the visible and the tangible world, it completely covers a human being, the pure spirit, and the spirit feels lost. So when it comes to the extreme, Swamiji says he is desperate to come out of this suffocation. He wants to evolve. The idea of freedom first arises. That is when religion begins. It is necessary to keep this idea of evolution very clearly in mind. Otherwise, our idea of freedom, why do we want nirvana, why do we want freedom, why do we want mukti, it cannot be explained. People say, I'm happy with all these things. I am freedom, I have free materially, I have enough wealth, I can just relax. But what about that? Will you be really free unless your mind is free? So you are struggling. So before we understand Patanjali's technique of meditation, it is an evolution in the reverse direction. We have gone to the level of matter. Now we have to go back from matter to subtle, from subtle to the causal, and then go to the Brahman. So meditation is a procession of not evolution, but evolution in the material sense, Charles Darwin's evolution. But beginning at the surface of life, the meditative mind goes inward. It follows the reverse direction. And then the cause behind the cause. What is the cause? Why the Karana Sharira, our Karana Sharira, is behaving in a particular way? What is the cause of our misery? What is the cause of our actions? Why do we do foolish things? So, where are our samskaras? What are our samskaras? Why are they asking us or making us think in a particular way? Why they give rise to depressive thoughts? So, the cause behind the appearance, the cause behind the reactions which we have with our reactive mind, We are interacting, and why do we get upset? Why do we get angry? Why do we have feel all this? So that cause, to search for that cause, is spirituality. That's what Patanjali says. Meditation just helps you to go inward, seek the cause. The cause is there. Right now, it is not very clear why we behave in a particular way. Neither do we know about ourselves, nor do we know about others. We try to help out each other in the material world, but we see finally we can do very little for the other person. That is what our sages found, that if you really want to help a child, help him to meditate, to go inward. That is the only thing we can do. Remember, our scriptures say the only thing we can do to help a child, a growing person, or even a youth, or anybody at any stage of evolution, is to teach him how to reverse the process of evolution and do meditation, to focus the mind, to reach the level of buddhi. If we do that, irrespective of what career he follows, what vocation he follows, what profession he follows, he or she, he is safe, because he knows it. He doesn't know only one way. It is like Abhimanyu. Abhimanyu was had partial knowledge of how to break the uh, Chakravyu. Chakravyu is a formation in the army where, if you want to go to the central part of that formation and try to defeat the opponent, you have to know how to cut through the defenses and go inside. That is known as Chakravyu. He knew how to go in, but he did not know how to go out. He did come out. So also we know how to react with the world. Our reactive mind, our entire education teaches us how to react with the world, how to behave nicely, what is the body language, how should. These are all external developments. They really don't matter, because ultimately, when we get lost in the gross people or the gross things or the gross objects do not come to our help. So we have to, the greatest benefit we can do to our growing up children, or growing up any human being who is trying to evolve, is to teach him the process of meditation, which is a process of devolution. Actually, it's not, it is not evolve, I mean, it is evolving spiritually, but from the material sense it is a devolution. Beginning at the surface of life, the meditative mind always has a tendency to go inward. Now we are doing that, doesn't mean that we have to give up external pursuits. That is the problem with most of the people. The moment you tell them, then what will happen to his external proficiency? We are so much worried about the external attainments of a child. We teach him how to excel in the material world, how to be good in mathematics, how to be good in physics, how to be good in so many subjects. But we don't teach him how to be good in meditation, to follow the which is absolutely necessary if he wants peace, joy, and know how to live in this world. And if he doesn't, if he gives up that quest of always seeking the cause, of this going away from his causal, the cause behind the appearance which he sees as soon as he is born, till the age of 5, he is happy with this, the conditions. He doesn't have a very prominent reactive mind. He has hunger, he has all the other basic urges of man, but at the same time he is happy. But slowly the layers of ignorance envelop him. He is made grosser and grosser, and he forgets the cause behind his pains and the cause behind his pleasures. So the Karana Sharira, the cause behind the Mahakarana, the Mahat, is what we should focus on with our Buddhi until the inmost reality is reached. So we go back to square one, we go back to the place from where we came, and that is freedom. Now let us consider Patanjali's 4 stages of concentration upon a single object. We were learning about that, Savitarka and all those things. So there are different levels of concentration. When you say, what do we, I'm sorry I'm repeating these things, but it is very important, because we have to understand why we should learn concentration, why we should teach concentration. If we know the 4 types of concentrations, we will know the results which we get with the help of these 5 concentrations, 4 concentrations. So There are 4 stages of concentration upon a single object. Now, we knew those 4 different Savitarka, we will not discuss. But what are the 4 stages? When we teach a child to meditate, when we teach a child to concentrate, when we teach ourselves, why a child? We ourselves are learning this art of concentration. So, what are there different levels of concentration? Definitely there are. Otherwise, how will we make progress in our meditation? So, there are 4 stages of concentration upon a single object. Now, that depending on what object you meditate upon, you will get the benefits. This is contrasted, the meditation on objects, Savitarka, is contrasted with the other kind, the higher kind of concentration, which is described in the next sutra. The concentration which goes deeper than all objects, the objective world, and unites itself with the pure undifferentiated consciousness. That is the spiritual concentration we speak of. Concentration on in mathematics and the external things are good. It can reveal those powers of Prakriti to you. It can result in excellence in certain fields. But concentration upon an internal object, pure undifferentiated consciousness, Satchidananda, Brahman, which we concentrate upon in the form of our Ishta for convenience, because we cannot meditate on an abstract concept of consciousness. We imagine, because the Ishta, the Lord whom we worship, has reached that state. We meditate upon that, hoping that one day, meditating on the gross form of our Ishta, the Leela of our Ishta, the actions of our Ishta Devata, or the God whom we worship, the physical, who came down in physical form for us. If we meditate upon that, we hope that one day we will be able to reach that state where we can meditate on the pure consciousness. So, meditation of pure consciousness is the highest meditation. But for that, we use the pure undifferentiated Sat, Chit and Ananda aspect of our own reality. We attain by meditating on our Ishta. So, concentration upon a single object is, however, a necessary and preliminary stage. So, when we object on a Shiva Linga or any symbol of God, or on a Christ or a church, the cross on which Jesus was crucified, it is the first stage. It's a preliminary stage, but one has to know that we have to go beyond that. When it is practiced intensely, it can take the reactive mind very far, right out to the ultimate border of undifferentiated matter. So we can get rid of the bondage of matter by focusing even on some material object, or a material form of God, or a human form of God. We are meditating on Sri Ramakrishna, who came in a human body, which was gross. So people may ask, how can meditation on a gross body lead to that? The difference is, Sri Ramakrishna in that very gross body touched the consciousness. Whereas if you worship another object which is gross, then you have to superimpose that pure consciousness, which is very difficult. So it is easier to meditate on an avatara or a great prophet, because that is why, in that sense, he is the Son of God. Since we cannot meditate on our Father in heaven, we meditate on the Son of God, or the avatara, who helps us like a window. Through that window, we can reach the ultimate. So, the words used to describe the 4 stages of concentration are not very easy to translate it in English. These words have to be, but still we will try. The first stage of examination, Savitarka, a stage of examination, you can say, is said to be reached when the mind becomes perfectly concentrated upon one of the gross elements. Savitarka, you can translate it, the stage of examination. We examine, we try to find out what is the reality behind this particular thing. So, this is followed by another state. When the mind becomes perfectly concentrated on one of the gross elements of nature, any gross element, it is known as the state of examination, Vitarka, Savitarka. This is followed by the stage of discrimination, where the mind pierces the outer material layer and fastens upon the tanmatra, the subtle essence. So, this is very important. We meditate on the gross element, and just wish that we get that gross element, the powers associated with that. But we don't go into the subtle nature. The discrimination helps us to dissect. It is like a dissection which happens when you cut open. You don't know what is there when you start the surgery. You have to dissect the body and then find out what is the problem to solve it. So this dissection is known as discrimination. So we dissect everything. Money, acha, how much money do I need? This is a gross thing on which we are meditating. We have decided to earn money, we have decided to hold money, we have decided to save money. That is fine. But if we just concentrate on that external gross object, it is a lower stage of meditation. The higher stage, we dissect it. We try to find out, wait a minute. What shall I do with the money? Try to discriminate how much of it I need. What all these things which where the buddhi is awakened, the wisdom of a human being is awakened, there he tries to give a value to the gross meditation. Gross meditation helps him to know how to acquire money, how to gather all these things. But the subtle meditation on the tanmatras, the subtle essence within these gross things, it is a second level of meditation. In the third level comes the stage of joyful peace, where we concentrate. Now the first we meditate on the gross aspects of matter or any object in the world. Then we meditate on the subtle. But third stage, we meditate when we concentrate on the inner powers. We just want to meditate on the inner powers which make us go towards this object. For example, we see certain things. We just don't discriminate whether it is good or bad. We also try to think, oh, what makes the mind, the tanmatra, what makes the power of perception, or upon the mind, the power of perception go towards certain objects. Can we not control it? When we control it, then we understand, it gives us peace. Why we get peace? Why we get immediate peace, joyful peace? It's not the highest peace of nirvana or moksha, but even at this stage we get peace because we win a victory over the gross elements. To give you a simple example, first we discriminate. We see say for example, a sweet, eating of which too much, or take any other object for that matter. So we know this object, we know the essence of it, how much of it we should consume. That comes the second stage. And then we decide that we will now, because it is harmful for us, I will try not to eat it. So what comes, we concentrate on the inner powers of perception. We perceive a thing, but we tell our mind, we tell our taste buds, it may be tasty, but it is harmful. So you just don't go after it. So that meditation, the third stage, gives us joy, because that joy of self-control, controlling the outward powers to be absorbed in the gross, is a third stage. And then finally, the fourth stage of concentration, the same concentration evolves. First, we meditate on the object, try to acquire it. At the animal level, it is just to run after the object and get it. Then we are as good as animals, because it is a reactive mind which is there. But now and then it may happen. It not only it may happen, it very often happens in human beings. There's nothing wrong in that, in going after the sense objects, because that is how we have involved. We have come down to this stage because of that. But a slightly better person who has meditated well, he meditates on the inner powers, the essence of those things, and then he distinguishes that it may be tasty right now, but after some time it is going to give me trouble. So that discrimination is a slightly higher kind of meditation. Then a third level, when the person advances in spirituality, he has better control over his organs. He says, I see the sweet, I see its merits and demerits, and I can control the mind which is running after that, control the subtle indriyas. And even though I see that object, I don't succumb to it. Then it gives you a small joyful peace, that you have resisted the temptation, and that is giving you joyful peace. But even that peace is not enough. That is why many people who do tapasya, they get stuck at this level of joyful peace. They want the whole world to know, see how much, and you might have observed this phenomena, that people try to glorify their capacity to fast, to live without food. It becomes to become a vegan, for example. Nowadays, that is the fashion. Oh, I don't eat these things, I don't eat that things. So the power of self-control gives a kind of joyful peace. And that is behind all these movements, behind this veganism and all. People say that we don't harm animals. So it gives a kind of peace. Otherwise, why will they do it? So they feel that they have lot of control. The moment they see the harmful things, the so-called uh, 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 fast food and other things which are so harmful, which people eat indiscriminately, discrimination helps you not to eat it. And that discrimination gives us, and the mind which tells you not to eat, that gives us some kind of joyful peace, though it is not the goal. Because if we get stuck at that, then we keep on um, glorifying ourselves, that see, I can control all these things. But that is not the that is just the third stage. The fourth stage is that the stage of simple awareness of individuality, that you just are aware of your existence, and you don't let any ripple come in your mind, neither that of desire nor that of controlling that desire. The desire is very natural. The organs will tell you, go after that particular item and eat it. But there is another faculty which gives you joyful peace. Say, don't eat it. But beyond that stage, that joyful peace is okay. But beyond that, higher peace comes when you just watch it as a witness. You don't concentrate. Simple awareness, that is known as awareness meditation. When we concentrate upon the ego sense, the first ego sense which comes in us, which tells us eat it, don't eat it. Even to tell don't eat it, you need the ego. But if you meditate on the ego itself, the most elemental form, untouched by any fear or desire, saying that I am Atma Rama. That is why Swami Vivekananda gave this wonderful adjective while describing Sri Ramakrishna. He was Atma Rama. He was untouched by any fear or desire. That is the highest joy. Those people, they're just Buddha, for example. He struggled. When he got nirvana, he said, see, this desire, absence of desire is a very, very peaceful state. Because if there is desire, there is fear. If there is fear, fear is nothing but the fear of not fulfilling your desire. I have a desire for wealth, I can't get it. I have a fear of losing wealth. I have the wealth, I have fear of losing it. So fear and desire are always taking us towards the gross. But absence of fear or desire, even for a small portion of our life, when we meditate, that gives us the highest form of joy. I'm not saying this power of meditation can become natural for 24 hours. If it becomes, it is good. But even occasional meditation makes us touch this higher level of concentration, the higher level of joy than mere self control. First level is the state of examination, that is savitarka. Then we distinguish, we discriminate, savichara, and then it come to nirvichara, the highest state, the fourth state, when there is no thought. The eye does not go after the object. Everything is seen, but we don't identify. Such concentration, the highest, the fourth one, is difficult enough. It may take a lifetime to achieve, but is still within prakriti. We are still within prakriti. This meditation, therefore, you say that it has its temptations and dangers. To know that the I nature of an object is to gain power over that object. An aspirant who grows in concentration may suddenly find that he develops certain psychic powers. Because when he is meditating on the gross objects, he knows the ins and out. At the second level of meditation, he may be able to heal, he may be able to read men's thoughts because he's focusing on other people, other human beings. So he can get certain powers because of intense concentration. These are these are different steps towards the goal, but we should not get stuck. He may be able to suddenly get some psychic powers. That is why Sri Ramakrishna did not want us to get stuck at these levels, because they will really not help. It will be positively harmful if we get stuck in Prakriti. We might have got rid of the gross objects. That is very easy to do. But if we get stuck in the subtle level, it is very difficult to extract. So he may be able to heal, foresee the future, or control the natural forces. The possession of such powers, it presents a tremendous temptation to misuse them for personal gain and ambition. So if that happens, the ego will again come, and again we will be stuck. Not only stuck, but we will be in deeper trouble. So eating a sweet or something may not be so harmful than succumbing to the pressure of using these psychic powers, which comes as a result of the second stage of meditation. And unfortunately, the people who run after the occult, who want to get some powers, who want to know certain things, they're curious, they want to know how to read other people's thoughts or foresee the future and many things, fortune tellers, going back into the past, trying to know so many things. Luckily for mankind, such irresponsible experimenters with these subtle powers, they do not achieve very much. Many times it is just a humbug. But if there is purity of motive, of course, Jesus Christ also healed, Sri Ramakrishna also helped, but they help at a mental level. They really solve the problems. They just don't give him the object he desires. They don't help a person grossly. They help him to get rid of desires. So when a person evolves, he uses the higher purposes for with a purity of motive. The motive is good. So, for example, if we say a drug in the hands of a responsible doctor, okay, many other drugs which are based on tranquilizers, if we know how to use it, it can be a beneficial pain killer. But if it goes into the wrong hands, people don't know how to use it. So a person become an addict to using the same drug. But if it is given in a positive way, then it can ease the pain of the patients. So a responsible doctor can use these medicines as a painkiller or but in the hand of an addict, it can destroy mental and physical health. So you see how these powers help. In a certain way it helps, but most often we see the powers are being misused by people and they get stuck. So it is better, the occult powers are used, if they are used by a saint with discrimination and non-attachment, with the sole intention of taking that person upward. He never regards these powers as the ends in themselves. They are not the ends, they are not the main thing. So he uses it to make a person evolve spiritually. For example, Christ once healed a person, a servant of one of his acquaintance in the garden of, they say, Gethsemane. Gethsemane, it is known as the garden of Gethsemane. But he refused at the same time. You see, he protected certain people. He healed a servant. He healed even a simple, humble person as a servant. But at the same time, he refused to protect his own life. So we know the motive was something different. His motive was not to get named. Otherwise, he could have used the same powers to save himself. But he valued the spirit, the evolution of the spirit, more than the evolution of these powers. So that's why we should not run after the miracles and be we give so much importance to the miracles done by all these so-called prophets and these holy people, not knowing that their motive for saving these people was different. It was not a selfish motive. If it were, then Jesus would have saved his own life. So he said he can easily protect, he could have easily protected him using, but the pure and the impure person who has full of desires, they acquire such powers. Even if they acquire such powers as a result of deep concentration and meditation, they cannot use them rightly. Sooner or later, they will come to ruin. So This is to be remembered when we focus on these 4 different levels of meditation. So Patanjali discusses all. You may ask the question, why does Patanjali discuss all these things? Because he is a strictly scientific person. A scientific personality will tell you the harmful effects of certain substances. He gives you warning and also gives the beneficial. For example, the painkillers. The doctor, the expert, a scientifically trained doctor knows how to use it and how not to misuse it. So spiritual scientists or prophets and these great saints, they prescribe certain techniques of meditation and also tell you the harmful effects if it is practiced in a wrong way. Therefore, they are like these ideal doctors who in a scientific way. So uh, just as a doctor has to give information, all the positive and negative effects of all the drugs, and so also a yoga expert has to explain what are the harmful effects of yoga if the concentration is not practiced in a proper way. And therefore, if we don't heed these warnings and dabble into these occult practices, then we are ourselves to blame. So, in the 18th verse, we speak of Virama Pratyaya Abhyasa Purva Sanskara Shesha Anya, the higher kind of concentration, which Patanjali is telling. He is telling us all the lower stages also, but he tells us in the 18th sutra that the higher kind of concentration, which is that in which the consciousness, the focus is not on any object, only the subconscious impressions, which are like burned seeds. It is attained by constantly checking the thought waves through the practice of non-attachment. That is why they give so much importance to non-attachment, because we have, our goal is not to focus on the two levels of gross and subtle, the sthula and the sukshma. Our problem is the karana sharira, the source of our problems, the source of our sorrow. So that bija which gives rise to repeated birth and death and all the suffering, has to be burnt. So the the and that can be burnt only by the light of pure consciousness, the light of pure sattva, the light of pure buddhi. So we have to raise our meditation. Virama pratyaya abhyasa purva. Pratyaya means giving up the thoughts or the desires which give rise to thoughts, which has its origin in the seeds, in the samskara, the bija, the seed form lying in our causal body. That has to be burnt. If that is burnt, no more depressing thoughts, no more sorrowful thoughts will come. So constantly checking the waves and focusing the light of buddhi on this. And that buddhi can be developed by non-attachment. So abhyasa and vairagya. Again, we come to the idea of vairagya. So vairagya serves the purpose of focusing all our energy, like you focus the rays and burn the seeds. Without the focusing of light, you can't burn, you can't create a fire. After having created, you know what you should burn. You should focus it on the samskaras, not on the other objects, otherwise it will burn you. So when the spiritual aspirant has achieved the highest degree of concentration upon a single object, he is ready on the 4th stage to concentrate on consciousness itself, not on the external objects. This is known as the perfect stage of yoga, according to Virama Pratyaya Abhyasa Purva Sanskara Shesha. When the sanskaras have been burnt away, when there is no more, the causal body does not harm you, no more sprouting of thoughts occur in your mind. That perfect state of yoga, where we pass, because Prakriti is manifest through these samskaras, these seeds. She seeds. Thakur used to give a beautiful example. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, the old nani in the house collects all the seeds from the field and keeps it in a pot, because she knows in the next cycle she has to plant it and again the tree will grow. But if the seeds are there, there is a chance that again the creation will come. The undifferentiated consciousness will not be attained. We will not become one with God. So, go beyond Prakriti to create a state where the seeds are burnt, and no matter how much the old woman plants, that is the Prakriti plants, we are not going to be born again. That is was the goal of all the spiritual people, the goal of Shuka, the goal of all the Shukadeva who refused to be born. Even if he was born, he knew that I am not going to be stuck and become worldly like the other people. Though I was born of a mother's womb, this time I came, he agreed to come out for the good of the world, but he knew. So, what does yoga philosophy? He knew that my goal is nirvana. Yoga philosophy, in essence, we'll conclude with this. Yoga philosophy teaches us that it is the samskaras, the karana sharira, which we have to deal with. They drive us from birth to birth. Just as strongly rooted addiction drives a man to take drug. Why does a man take to drug again and again? Even if repeated attempts, he cannot stop himself. That is because the roots are very strong. The addiction, the roots, deeply rooted addiction drives a man to take a drug over and over again. In spite of all his conscious disinclination, he is told, don't take it, don't take it. But he takes. And all the efforts of the moral will which he has developed, there are people who try to help him out of this, but he again goes. Why? Because the samskaras have not been burnt. So yoga says, just like you take drugs again and again, you are tempted to be born again and again because of your desires. And unless you burn it, you will not get peace, nor will you get the joy of nirvana. So that is how this verse is explained. And finally, we'll conclude by saying, we may see, we sincerely believe that we are wary of this world. When there is sorrow, everybody says, we are not this, I don't like to be born again. This world has created me, given me so much of trouble with all its interrelated pleasures and pains and the sweet and bitter fruits which the bird eats. When it eats sweet fruits, it's happy. When it eats bitter fruits, it doesn't want. But that is the nature of a fruit. You can't pick and choose. You have to taste it. So, if we are we have the subconscious tendencies, we will do this again and again. That is what the Upanishad says. We have to taste the bitter and sweet fruits. But our desire to return to the subconscious tendencies, if they were to be removed, then we have to touch that spiritual center of ours, Atma Rama. We have to learn to be happy within ourselves. If we get a touch of God by this higher meditation, then we will not be tempted so much. We will be tempted, but not so much. It will not drag us down. So, this temporary fits of disgust and repentance, oh, I will never do it, that those things will not come, because you are wise enough to know the consequences of getting involved in all these things, how they can drag you down. So the taste of the higher bliss, the taste of higher concentration, the goal of the fourth stage of concentration is to make you taste the bliss a little bit, that eternal joy, or a semblance of that eternal joy when you come to the third stage, that you feel that you should yearn more and more for that eternal peace and joy. So I'll conclude. We have already taken more time. So I'll just see, there are 2-3 questions. I'll just try to answer. What is the difference between layer of ignorance and the higher order of buddhi? And by meditating, going through the 4 stages, the difference can be eliminated. Is it so? Yes, the difference between the layer of ignorance, which is more gross, and the higher order of buddhi, the higher or the more sattvic buddhi. We don't meditate on tamasic and rajasic objects or desires. And when you meditate on sattvic people, sattvic prophets, the saints who has reached a higher order of buddhi, then the difference between the ignorance, the lower ignorance and the higher ignorance, that is also ignorance. Sattva is also ignorance, but it is lower. So we raise ourselves. That is the answer. Why did God create us to look outwards and make it difficult? That is the question which every scripture asks. So in Christianity, it says Adam and Eve, the fall of Adam and Eve. So these are some things why which cannot be answered why. because we know that it is a process. The Buddha, when Buddha was asked, that's why he did not want to discuss the concept of why it happened. His simple question, Buddha's simple question to everybody who asked him, do you believe in God? He said, did I say I believe in God? Then they said, oh, that means you don't believe in God. He said, did I say I don't believe in God? His idea was, don't bother about this why God has created. He says, do you believe that you have sorrow? He was more practical. So he said, if there is sorrow, then think of removing it. Why do you bother how the sorrow came? For example, Sri Ramakrishna used to give a beautiful example. If a thorn or a arrow hits your leg, the first thing you have to do is remove it because it is causing pain. You don't have to, you don't go, impractical man only will try to find out who has hit the arrow, just run after him. First remove your pain, first remove your sorrow. And that is why these prophets give so much importance. They say, don't go after this philosophy of why you became sorrowful. There are answers, we can get those answers, but it is of no use because you're not going to know unless you go out of the. That is why Thakur could explain, these people who got realization, Buddha could explain, they could show us what causes sorrow. We don't believe them. They have found out the way, why is all these things happen, but that doesn't solve our problem. If you know how the sorrow has come, if you know how God created, why he made it outward, will it going to help? We have to go inward to find it. And that is the whole goal of life. So we rather focus on what helps us to go inward rather than think of what made us go outward. What made us do all these things? If we focus on the negative side, I mean, it's not going to help. But they have given us the solution. Upanishad, Gita, every scripture gives us the solution. The last is the last is about food. Somebody has asked, when you talk about food, I do not eat this vegan. It reminds me of an attitude, and maybe I am stuck in this cycle and the state of mind. So should I not think about this? Yeah, the thing is, too much of obsession you will get stuck because you think you have achieved something. That is the third stage where he says it gives you a joy, a kind of joy. It's the third stage of meditation where you think you have controlled this, you have controlled that, and you don't go after the higher consciousness. So in a way, it is, for a higher sadhaka, it is harmful. But for a person who is always eating or always succumbing to the temptations of this thing, it may be a good idea. Even if you have some kind of ego, it is fine. But at least after reaching the third stage, you have to go to the fourth stage. That's the idea. Is there any? I feel there are plenty of decision checkpoints. Do this, do that. Don't do this, don't do that. Can it happen that the Ishta look after us in terms of decisions if we fully resort to the mantra? So even if we are taking a wrong step, Ishta protects us. Definitely, definitely. This is one of the benefits of practicing mantra seriously. You give the power of attorney to the Ishta to do all these things. The more you repeat the mantra, more you depend on him, you will find that the things. Swami Vivekananda gave a beautiful quote. He says, manifest the divinity within and everything else will be harmoniously arranged around it. So we try in desperation to create harmony around us, but it doesn't happen. But if you focus and spend the time, spend the time usefully without bothering about why there is disharmony outside, why is he behaving like that, why is she behaving like that, why things are so bad, why the situation is so bad, that is just wasting our energy. So if you focus on the mantra, what actually happens is, first of all, you become positive. Even though the solution may not come immediately, but you see, as you go on doing more and more mantra, I can promise you this, every prophet, every saint or every sadhaka has experienced this, that as he goes, if something is wrong and if we lack in the practice of our sadhana, then things may not happen as speedily or as fast as we want them to be and the way we like. But sometimes even the unfortunate happenings also may be useful for us. It has some lesson to teach us. So focusing on to do this, do that, and all those checkpoints which you are speaking of, if we fully resort to the mantra, I mean, as much as possible. You see, you have to keep your discriminate. It improves the buddhi. So you will see after a certain time, your own mind, your own buddhi will tell you the decision checkpoints, the decision making becomes easy. The decisions which you find hard now, as you go on practicing the mantra, the same decision making process becomes easy because of a refined buddhi. So even if it takes a wrong step, he will not protect you in the sense you will have to uh, say suffer the consequences, but it can be minimized. You see, you cannot expect that you will never take a false step because we have not fully surrendered to God. In Girish Ghosh's case, he had fully surrendered. So it was easy for him to make rapid advancement. But since our faith is not so much, we have to increase our faith in our sadhana, in our mantra, and that definitely helps. Okay. So what is the difference between Anandamay Kosha, Ananda of Anandamay Kosha and Ananda of Satchidananda? There is a huge difference. As we discussed just now, in the fourth stage of meditation and the third stage of meditation, the Anandamay Kosha is in that state where you have absolute control over Prakriti, but the seeds are still there. When the seeds are destroyed, the joy is immeasurable. So that joy of Satchidananda is a very, very enhanced or an infinite joy which cannot be compared with the joy of the Anandamay Kosha. Anandamay Kosha we feel even when we are in deep sleep, when the seeds, when the samskaras become dormant, they don't trouble us, we get a good sleep. That is also Anand, but is that joy? The joy of sleep. So if I tell you, you will get good sleep every day, will you be happy with that? We want a higher joy, and that joy is the joy of Satchidananda. Okay, so I'll take your leave. We have already exceeded the time. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.